This is Chapter 7, Part 1 of The Judgement by Terry Daniels. If you haven't heard all the chapters from the beginning, please return to the main channel and listen from there. Please like and subscribe. If you'd like to continue, please bear in mind this book does contain language and scenes of violence that some may find offensive. Chapter 7. Z. The day had begun like any other during the long summer holiday. It was hot, very hot. Hot enough to make some of the road tarmac sticky to the touch near the curbside. Hot enough to see panting dogs trying to find shade along the streets, and panting men as the fashion for women's hot pants reappeared. Songs like In the Summertime and Summer in the City played endlessly on daytime radio. Much like the usual Christmas songs having their monthly moment till you were blue in the face with them, the same could be said for the Summer Breeze and the many others. Now would be their time. Zed loved these holidays. He was at that pivotal age where he was neither boy nor man. A boy in that he would always be arguing with one of his parents over being late home, drinking alcohol or smoking Embassy No. 6 around the back of the toilet block in the local park. That's if he had two parents, which he didn't. His only parent, his mother, was a washed-up wreck of a woman who relied on her only son to keep the house and provide the meals. She wasn't disabled, but so ravaged by circumstances that she blamed the world and her only son for all her problems. She had stopped going outdoors some time just after the new year, which left her son to look after everything whilst maintaining school and keeping his nose clean. Neither of them wanted social services involved, as both knew Zed would then have to go and live with foster parents while she would be incarcerated in some loony bin. They had recently had a close shave, with Zed finding a box of live ammunition on the way to school, and subsequently had been brought home in a police car. His mum had been drunk, but fortunately was asleep on the sofa, so the police had not suspected the family situation. Zed had been suspended for 2 weeks, and this had allowed him to look after his mum and get the house back in order. All this care had meant that he was not able to mix with his school friends. This had suited him just fine. He had no real friends, and was only thick with one other boy, Thomas Cooper. This friend had also been involved in the ammunition find, but, as well as being suspended, had received a beating from his dad. The Coopers lived on the other side of town, in a block of flats known locally as El Gangster Village. Its reputation was one of notoriety. Take any local council of any city or town in any part of the country, and they all had a plan of housing for those families who required attention. It was always a series of flats or tower blocks well away from the town centre, where the employed and the prosperous lived. These families would then benefit from the community atmosphere that housing departments seemed to imagine would happen. Things would go wrong very quickly, and drug users, prison offenders, and gangs would clump together to all growl at the rest of society on the fringes of their part of the urban jungle. Tommy had lived there all his life, and had seen and heard most things. He had been in trouble a few times, both with rival gangs and police, but had such a cheeky smile and self-confidence that it seemed to lift him up from the muddy and filthy undergrowth. His father had been in prison some time back when Tommy was a small boy. He knew it had involved armed robbery, and didn't see his dad for several years while growing up. His mother had refused to take her small son to Maidstone Prison to visit him on account that she felt that the experience would damage the boy's outlook on life. She definitely did not want him following in his father's footsteps, and did all that was possible to stop this. When Dad had returned, Tommy had witnessed his mum getting slapped in the face by his father so many times that he began to believe that it was the norm. That was how men treated their wives. Work was hard to come by at that time, and Tommy Senior, choosing names for his children had never been the man's forte, had gone from job to job, from building site to building site, and finally bounced from both employment centres housed in the town. Not content with having his own childhood ruined by having the exact name as the famous comedic magician, he named his only son exactly the same. Tommy's mum had never worked as far as he knew. She had never provided him with any brothers or sisters either, so Tommy was the apple of her eye. Her one purpose in life was to give her son a decent start and a chance to shine in the big, wide world of opportunity, not the shitty one that was all she had ever known. Because of this, she took the slaps and beatings that his dad would give her, even when there was no reason at all, and the man just wanted to blame someone and take out all his frustrations. He did not hit his son for no reason. Tommy Senior was a proud man and despised violence on his child. When, and only when, little Tommy was bad, did he punish his son by beating him. In his mind there was a difference. Despite the smothering protection of his mother and the fists of his father, Tommy was a bit of a lad. His confidence soared and he became almost a hero to Zed. They had both known absent fathers and were both the only child in their families. They had many things in common, but Zed did not have the charisma that Tommy possessed. Tommy did not have the common sense that his friend had, so together they were perfectly matched. Tommy was the smaller of the two friends. Poverty had provided him with ill-fitting clothes, greasy and lank brown hair, and an oily face that you could fry an egg on. None of these qualities bothered Tommy. If you knocked him down, which his father often did, he would bounce back up again and challenge the world. Neither boy had ever had a girlfriend. Tommy only knew that if you had a woman in your life, you had to smack her about a bit to keep her in line. Tommy didn't want to do this. What he did have at home was a pornographic magazine that he had stolen from his local newsagent. As luck would have it, the magazine in question had been sitting on the lower shelf behind a gardening monthly. It had at some point been taken down from the top shelf, normally out of reach from his small frame, and placed within easy access of the delighted child. When Zed had come round one day and the bedroom door had been firmly closed, Tommy had shown him the magazine. On one occasion, Tommy had openly masturbated in front of Zed, with the magazine open in front of them both. Zed had been shocked, but Tommy explained all boys did it, and it didn't mean you were queer, as the magazine was full of naked, open-legged women. After an awkward couple of minutes, Zed joined in, and after a few more visits the magazine would be a regular pastime, with both boys in challenging themselves about who could ejaculate the fastest and the most. Tommy's mum adored Zed. Every time he visited, she would smile and hug him. She hoped that the friendship would keep her son on a straight and narrow. Zed had told her about his own mum, and that she wasn't very well, and she had thought this was wonderful, how he could be so considerate and responsible. Having Zed round to the flat also meant that Tommy Senior wouldn't lay a hand on her all the time the boy was there. A small reprieve, but one she cherished. She had constantly invited him to stay the night, but Zed could not afford to be away from home for such a long time. She would keep on asking. Anything to keep her husband's angry fists away from her. The flat lived in by the Cooper family was small, on the 5th floor of the concrete building, and noisy. The walls were thin enough to hear everyone else's business, music tastes, or blazing rows. Some of the wallpaper was beginning to peel in almost every room. Nicotine stained the ceiling and yellowed the light switches. Both Mr. and Mrs. Cooper smoked constantly. The air hung heavy with it like a floating blanket. Tommy didn't smoke, but still had the cough. There were 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom, and a room that couldn't decide if it was a kitchen, dining room or lounge. Each room contained the barest essentials, and each room was in need of some repair or other. Some of the rooms had a multitude of vintage dining stains upon the wall, with some doors either cracked or dented. These were the reminders of previous arguments and thrown meals, courtesy of Tommy Senior. Even one of the walls on Tommy's bedroom had a small hole, revealing the plaster beneath. This had caused much merriment in the class one day, when all the pupils had been asked to describe what was on their bedroom wall. After many comments of pop stars, film stars, and ban the bomb posters, Tommy had declared loudly that his wall had a fucking great hole. The detention awarded to him was worth it just to see the teacher's face. Zed liked going round there as he would be assured of a cooked meal. This worked well if his mum was asleep after drinking. The summer holidays were going well, as every day the boys would meet in the park and then return to Tommy's flat for burger and chips and the glossy photographic charms and open thighs of the lovely Zarina and co. The holidays also brought up a few dilemmas at home. One major one was money. Zed wasn't bothered about fashion or going to the cinema, but he would like to have had a bit more cash to spend, a little more for himself. He didn't begrudge his mum for her vodka and cigarettes, as these made her happy and gave him the freedom to leave the house, but it was just to have a few quid in his pocket which would make him feel more secure. Make him like the man of the house, the provider. He knew he would be leaving school for good shortly, and that meant some major life decisions. His love of all things military would be a perfect introduction to the armed forces. His talent and knowledge of electrical and mechanical would be a perfect launch pad for the engineers. He had often passed by the small yet brightly lit office of Her Majesty's Royal Engineers recruiting shop and had stopped himself from being tempted in like a moth to a flame. It had amused him how, in theory, you could walk down the local high street and purchase a dozen eggs, some cigarettes, potatoes, a newspaper or saucy magazine, and a career as a professional killer. Only one thing was preventing this dream from being a reality: his mother. She had no one else that could care for her. There was apparently an auntie somewhere, but there had been no contact between each sister for as long as Zed could remember. "That fucking bitch of a sister," was the last description he had heard from the lips of his mother. There was nobody else. He would have to provide and hope she got better. Maybe a man would be an alternative. Some 40-ish respectable businessman to turn her life around and make her happy with flowers and countryside walks. She never left the house nowadays, so the possibility of meeting someone suitable was virtually zero. Who was he kidding? He would have to step up and be the man. He wanted to change the scene anyway. He was starting to have some erotic thoughts and dreams about Tommy's mother, and was finding her hugs a little too pleasurable. It must be the women in that magazine. He was getting addicted to mature ladies. That couldn't be good. The last dream he had experienced the previous night had involved him pleasuring himself with the magazine in front of him, and she walked into his bedroom without knocking. This then led to all sorts of fantasies and an embarrassing stain on the bedsheet. Just by chance on this beautiful morning, Zed decided to take a walk through the high street and through a couple of alleys on his way to the park to meet Tommy. He was going to tell his friend that they would have to cut down on their meetings as his mum was bad again. It was the easiest excuse in the world, as Tommy had never visited his house because of the illness. Zed didn't invite anyone round. The house was a mess and his mum was unpredictable. She may be scared of someone else in the room. He was afraid that the sight of her tired, alcohol-strained face would put his friend off. Most of all, though, the reason was his pride. He did his best to keep the house tidy, but the washing, cleaning and cooking wasn't made for a teenage boy, and their roles had reversed. He was now the carer. The small nag of bitterness was starting, like a caterpillar on a leaf, to gnaw away at the structure of their existence. He wanted more. He didn't want this circle of responsibility. Sometimes he blamed his father for no longer being around. Sometimes the blame was on his mother for not being able to step out of her cesspool of misery and actually allow him to live his life. Sometimes. As he walked through the first alley off the local high street, he saw that the double door to Simpson and Son Mechanics was open. It was almost a converted garage, and there was just enough room to allow a small car to drive down the alley and into his workshop. Zed knew Mr. Simpson quite well. He often said hello as he passed, and had on one occasion gone back to the high street to fetch the man a pint of milk to save him the bother of closing up. "Thieving bastards would strip me dry as soon as me back was turned," he explained to Zed. "I appreciate it, son." Zed had found that tag amusing, as it had transpired on a later conversation that there was no son in Simpson and Son Mechanics. He had made that up to give him the look of being a well-established business enterprise. "I've got a daughter," he explained, "only she can't fix shit." As Zed passed by the open door on this bright morning, he took an opportunity to look into the murky building. The transistor radio was playing as usual in the background, but could only just be heard due to the constant banging and clanging coming from the rear. "Morning, Mr. Simpson," called out Zed as loudly as he could, and saw the mechanic turn round and look from where the greeting had come from. "Oh, good, it's you," he replied, and the clanging immediately stopped as he stood up and stretched his back with an arthritic groan. "Just a minute there, young fella. Stay where you are." Mr. Simpson reached into his oily overalls — Zed had never seen him in anything else — and pulled out an even oilier cloth, which he then proceeded to wipe his hands. "You have perfect timing. I'd like a word with you." Zed waited for the man to come near the entrance. He noticed he was squinting from the bright light outside. "Bugger me, it's sunny out here, ain't he?" said, and smiled at the boy. "Are you in a rush at the moment, young'un?" "Nowhere special," replied Zed. "Do you need something from the shop?" "Actually, no," answered Mr. Simpson. "It's you I need. I want to pick your brains. You said to me before that you were pretty good at mechanics. Have I got that right?" "Yes, sir," replied Zed. He saw the mechanic frown. "You can cut the sir crap out with me, boy." The man smiled. It was a friendly but mainly toothless smile that occupied most of his small face. Only the large ears helped balance out the features. "If you fancy it, I've got a motorbike in the back that's giving me some grief. Can't get these podgy bloody fingers to finger the carburettor on these small Japanese engines. Bastards make 'em too small. Do you reckon you can have a look like? There's a couple of quid in it if you fix it." Mr. Simpson looked at the boy but received no answer. "You gone deaf, lad?" he asked. Zed suddenly realised that he was standing still like a fool. This was a stroke of luck, and he couldn't move his mouth because he was so excited. "No. I mean yes," he exclaimed. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Simpson. You want me to look now?" He saw the man smile at him. "No. How about a week on Thursday? That suit you?" The man watched confusion spread over the boy's face like a rash. "Of course now, you daft bugger. Get yourself in there then. No time to waste." Zed smiled and followed the mechanic into the rear of the garage. Mr. Simpson had most things stored here. Spanners and ratchets of all sizes hung off bent nails, hammered into the wooden shelves. Screwdrivers and empty bottles of engine oil sat strewn on the work table, alongside used spark plugs and soiled rags. Everything inside seemed to be in chaos, yet Zed loved it. The smell of the oil and rust oozed out of the structure itself. This was like a second home to Mr. Simpson, and he boasted he knew exactly where everything was. "Everything in its place, and a place for everything," declared the yellowed poster on the wall. The only piece of motivation hung alongside an aging Playboy calendar for 1971. A small pile of clipboards on the table strained from the paper receipts clipped to them. Light strained through a greasy window at the back, with a filthy net curtain attempting to shield the contents. To the average eye, the garage looked like a derelict building. To a teenage boy who possessed a love for mechanics, it was a palace, Zed placed his eyes on the motorbike, and his smile increased. He had seen one of these before. Just as luck would have it, one of his school teachers had ridden one in the summer months and had invited Zed to look at it one lunchtime in the teacher's parking area, as it didn't seem to be ticking over. To the amazed teacher, the boy managed to rectify the problem within 5 minutes. It was always good to be owed a favour by a member of staff at your school. Zed placed his hands on the handlebars and tried the throttle. It seemed to be sticking. This was the most likely cause. He would have to ensure that he didn't fix it too quickly. He had a good feeling about this, and if he managed to please the mechanic, he may even get a chance to come back and help out on a regular basis. Zed looked back over to Mr. Simpson, who had already laid on his back underneath another vehicle, and whistled tunelessly to the radio. Zed had always loved bikes and cars. Electronics seemed to come easy to him also, but his first love was petrol engines. He reckoned that if you knew how one worked, how each piston pumped and every cog turned, then the principle was the same from a lawnmower to a diesel express train. He had no clue as to where the talent or influence had come from, certainly not from his mother, who didn't have a talent for anything. Maybe his father or even a distant dead grandfather somewhere. There were a few photographs tucked in a cupboard somewhere, and Zed had seen his mum once or twice take them out and cry salty tears onto them. He wasn't bothered in looking at them. He was his own man now, and that man was never coming back. What was the point of living in the past? This was half the reason why his mum never left the house. She was afraid of the future, nervous of the present, and obsessed with crying over the past. Nothing would ever change from what had been. Zed was trapped with her memories and regrets. Maybe this could be an opportunity for him to begin a life he so desperately craved. He grabbed the relevant spanners from the rack, and within a few minutes had stripped and cleaned the carburettor. Turning the key, the small engine puffed out smoke from the exhaust and purred into life. On hearing this, Mr. Simpson slid back out from under the car and looked at the boy. "Top lad," he cried. "You know your stuff, then?" He turned his head to one side and spat on the floor. "I've been fiddling with that bastard for days. Turn it off and put the kettle on, sonny. I'll finish this bit and we can have a brew." With that, his ample frame slid back under, and the off-key whistling continued. Zed was pleased with himself, but tried not to let his smugness show too much. It had been a stroke of luck that it was an easy fix. There was nothing like impressing someone. He looked over to the corner of the garage and saw a partitioned area, no bigger than a toilet cubicle, shielding itself away from public view, and containing a very grimy toilet, and an even grimier shelf above it. On the shelf were the essentials for tea making. The glass jar had leaves and a strainer. The milk bottle was warm, but on one sniff, Zed established that it was usable. Next to it sat a creased paper bag of Tate & Lyle's sugar, with a spoon sticking out the top. Inside the packet were many rock shapes of yellowed sugar clumps. There was no sink, only what appeared to be a converted outdoor tap crudely screwed into the brick. At least there were 2 cups. Lastly, the kettle stood precariously on the end of the shelf, with its lead attached to an extension lead. This lead then went back outside, where it formed part of a tower of plugs, all stuck into one power socket. Zed chose the cup with the least cracks, filled the kettle with what he thought would be enough for 2 cups, and switched it on. The light hanging from the ceiling dimmed slightly. He decided that Tommy and the park would have to wait. This was more important. Just as he was about to go back into the garage, he saw a car pull up alongside the entrance, and his heart sank as he recognised the driver. Mr. Ward was a neighbour of his, and not a very nice one. A typical old man who always liked to complain. Although he lived 3 doors down from Zed and his mother, Mr. Ward was a widower, an ex-army major, and a stickler for neighbourhood protocol. All rubbish would be picked up, all grass verges would be cut and trimmed in a regimental fashion. Mrs. Ward had passed away some 5 years before, and many reckoned it was due to her husband's constant nagging. When she was alive, their windows were always sparkling. The front door step was painted and polished. She was forever out the front tidying, pruning and weed pulling, while her husband kept a close eye from their sitting room window. Should she show signs of slowing or not trim a plant correctly, a sharp rap on the glass would be heard, and the glaring face and pointing finger of Mr. Ward could be seen getting his poor suffering lady wife to rectify. Zed could never remember her smiling. He always ensured he walked swiftly by, but unfortunately he would have to pass their house to enter his. Since his wife's untimely departure from life, Mr. Ward had increased his surveillance and despising looks to all the neighbours along their street. He had retired from the armed services some time ago, and now, with no wife to boss about, ensured that all of his energies were directed into licking his neighbours into shape. These people were now his regiment, and he would take no shit from any of them. All of the adjoining occupants, young and old, complied and refused to retaliate. Their lives were far too busy to have to deal with the raging Major, as he became known. Mr. Ward looked for the weakest link in his small empire. Zed and his mother, with no father figure, became an easy target. The countless empty vodka bottles and cigarette packets in their weekly bin did not help their cause. The raging Major despised single mothers and alcoholics. Queers, the Irish, and loose women were also on his striking list. The local constabulary were often recipients of his scathing reports and complaints. They wrote it down, recorded it, and promptly forgot it. Mr. Ward kept all his letters on file by ensuring a copy was handwritten and dated. He was a small man with an attitude like a Rottweiler. A pencil-thin moustache was exactly the correct length across his mean top lip, and what remained of his hairline was cut army fashion, greased and adorned with a green beret bearing the badge of his regiment. Zed thought that he must have an endless supply of them, as the man was never seen without one. A crisp shirt and flat, straight tie were mainly hidden behind the grey or sometimes beige cardigan. The pressed trousers and mirrored shine on the black shoes completed the look. Zed did not like this man. The feeling from him was mutual. Mr. Ward had loathed the boy ever since Zed had shouted at him to "go suck yourself" one morning as he was putting out the empty bottles into the dustbin and was trying desperately not to make a noise. "Your mother is a disgrace," the Major had called out, and this had prompted the boy's reply. It had been worth it to see the shock on the man's face, but that was a few months ago, and his neighbour had not let it drop. Every time Zed had passed by the house, Mr. Ward had muttered, "You are a filthy, mouthed boy." Zed had not had the energy to wage a verbal war, and now, through simple bad timing, here he was in front of Mr. Simpson's garage. Zed had the very man in his vision. He ducked himself into the toilet cubicle and peeked through a small hole to look out at the car. His neighbour had not seen him, and to Zed's surprise was actually smiling at Mr. Simpson. "Morning, Bob," said the Major. "Morning to you, Reg," replied the garage owner. "The old girl need another service already?" Both men looked at the small car gleaming in the sunshine. "Every 6 months," said Reg. "You know me, I can't abide slackness." His neck jerked slightly. "Any problems?" asked the mechanic. "Absolutely none. She purrs along a treat. Just need the oil and filter and the whatnots seen to, if you please." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the service book. "Get this thing stamped as well. Everything in order?" Zed was shocked to hear him laugh a little. "You want me to do it now?" inquired Bob. No, replied Reg. "No rush. It's a wonderful day for walking. Shall I leave it in your capable hands and stroll up here tomorrow morning? He smiled again and waved the car keys in his hand invitingly. That would suit me perfect, Reg. I've got a bit of a tricky one on at the moment, but since it's you, I'll get straight onto yours afterwards. He took the dangling keys. Same deal as always for you? Bob gave him a wink. Keep the taxman guessing, eh? Absolutely, Bob, absolutely. Reg Ward turned sharply on his toes and with a quick nod marched off back towards the high street. Ensuring it was clear, Zed reappeared from the back and came to stand beside the mechanic. Strange bloke, if you ask me, muttered Bob as they both stared at the disappearing Major. Has his car serviced every 6 months. Nothing ever wrong with it. He always pays cash, never a word to the government. You think a man of his stature would be as straight as a die? Zed smiled to himself. It was nice to have something finally on this man, a chink in his armour. He's a local man too. You don't know him, do you? Bob looked at Zed. Not really, Zed lied. I think he lives somewhere along my road. I don't pay much attention to my neighbours. He left it there and hoped he wouldn't be asked any more awkward questions, as he hated lying. That's just as well then, young'un, because if you've got a bit of time still, I'd like you to service that man's motor. You know the thing. Plugs, filters and all that. But don't bother changing the oil. The old sod won't know either way. And I'll wager he doesn't go very far in it now that his old missus passed away. It'll save me a little bit of money. He threw the car keys to Zed. Have a look on the inside too. Give it a swish round with the polish. Bit more money in it for you if you fancy. Zed gave Bob a reassuring smile and went back to the rear of the garage and returned with the teas. Shall I leave yours here? Asked Zed as he put the cup next to Bob's trolley. Lovely, said Bob. Right, I'm back under this bloody car again. All the stuff you need is over on the shelf there. If you can't find anything, then give me a shout. But I swear if I have to get up from under this thing again, I'm going to rupture myself. He laughed quietly to himself and noisily climbed back under the car. Zed went over to the shelf and found all the parts he needed. Remarkably, everything seemed to be in some kind of order. He went outside to Mr. Ward's car and looked down the road to ensure the man had not forgotten anything and was returning back. It would be awful to be seen, especially since Zed had his car keys in his hand. It was all clear. He took a sip of tea and tasted the bitter tannin in the back of his throat. The day was beginning to look up. He could get used to this. He opened the passenger door and reached in for the bonnet release. A clean, disinfectant odour hit his nostrils from the interior of the car. It didn't surprise him that the man kept the inside meticulously tidy. A wicked thought of spitting onto the gear lever entered his mind. The old bastard would have deserved it, but he rejected the idea instantly. There was no point in jeopardizing this opportunity. He pulled the lever and heard a spring click. The bonnet lifted slightly. He went back outside and raised up the metal and pulled out the pole to hold it. Bob Simpson had been right. The engine looked as though it had just come from the new car forecourt. There was no oil or spills to be seen. This was going to be easy. Over the next 20 minutes, Zed had changed all the necessary and topped up all the fluids. Bob was still underneath the other car. The radio still churned out tunes of the day, and the man was still whistling tunelessly along. Zed went to the rear and found a relatively clean rag with which to wipe his hands. He would give the interior a decent polish now. The old man didn't deserve it, but Zed wanted to impress and was actually enjoying himself. He returned to the car armed with a soft cloth and polish, closed the bonnet with a soft click, and went around to the driver's seat. If only the Major could see him now. He would have gone mad with fury. It made Zed smile. He began to wipe over the steering wheel and dials. There was no dust to be found, but at least the polish smelt refreshing. With the duster in his left hand, he rubbed over the glove compartment, and the door accidentally fell open. Inside, aside from the manual and a small tin of boiled sweets, Zed was amazed to find a spare set of keys for the car. What kind of idiot does that? Thought the boy, and reached in to pick them up. Considering the man was supposed to be so thorough with his neighbourhood watch security, this was sloppy practice. He pondered briefly about what to do while the keys nestled in his hand. He couldn't leave them in there, he decided, because if the vehicle was broken into overnight, the keys would allow the thief to simply start the car and drive it away. He didn't know too much about car insurance, but thought that information wouldn't look great on any claim. He made up his mind to take them in with the polish and the other key and give them to Bob to keep inside. Maybe the mechanic could have a quiet word to the Major about car security. Zed placed the spare set into his jacket pocket and continued to polish. He would ensure a professional finish, even though he despised the old man. It was the mechanic he wanted to impress. After he had done as much as he possibly could with the limited talents of his cloth, he opened the driver door and heard a sudden banging on the rear windscreen. His heart leapt out of his chest as he thought the Major must have returned and saw him sitting in the car. With frightened eyes, he looked into the rear-view mirror and saw the smiling face of Thomas Cooper glaring at him. Tommy was gesturing with one hand to come out and banging on the roof with the other. "For Christ's sake," Zed uttered under his breath. Apart from the Major, this was the last person he had wanted to see. Tommy continued to bang on the roof as Zed pulled out the key and stepped outside, shutting the door. "There you are," called Tommy. "Been looking for you. You never showed up at the park." "Got delayed, didn't I?" replied Zed. "Just helping out Mr. Simpson." Tommy smirked. Zed noticed one of his eyes was darkened by a bruise. "Didn't think you was into cleaning cars, mate. Has he got anything worth nicking then?" Tommy laughed to himself. "Shut up, just bloody shut up," thought Zed, and took Tommy's hand off the roof of the car. "What happened to your eye?" he asked. A bruise was now quite distinctive in the sunlight. "Fell out of my folks again," answered Tommy, and his hand subconsciously went to the bruise. "Dad hit me and Mum yelled at me. I can't stand 'em, bastards. I feel like putting my fists through this rear window." "Nothing too hasty, eh?" Zed put his arm around his friend. "I'm just about done here. Why don't we go down to the park now, talk it over? Let me just pop in and see Mr. Simpson here and give him these keys and duster and stuff." Zed pulled off his jacket and offered it over to Tommy. "Take this, would you?" he said as his friend took the jacket. "I'll meet you down there." Zed smiled at his friend reassuringly and was relieved when Tommy grunted a "OK" and walked in the direction of the park. Zed was afraid that Tommy was in such an angry mood he would have scratched the car or worse. With relief to see his friend walking away, he made his way into the garage just as Bob Simpson was sliding out from under the car. "Fixed at last," he uttered and looked at Zed. "Done a dusting as well, lad? I take it the service was OK?" "All done, Mr. Simpson," replied Zed. "Just wanted to ensure it's shiny on the inside too. Where would you like the keys?" "I'll take them now," said Bob. "Better lock 'em in the safe. Don't want that old crony having a go at me in the morning." Bob got himself up with a groan and took the keys and duster. Zed watched him go to the back of the garage and saw him squat beside a metal safe under the table. With 2 clicks the door opened and the keys were safely placed inside. Bob relocked the door and rose to his feet to look back at the boy. "That's a good job there, young'un," he said, and pulled 3 £1 notes out from his overalls. "I might have to move his car back to the main road tonight before I leave, so I'll quickly check under the bonnet, but I'm sure all is well. Here," he said, and waved the £1 notes out to the boy. "These are for you. I don't suppose you can come back in the morning? About 10? I reckon the Major will have collected his car by then, and there's a few more jobs you can be helping me with." Zed reached over and took the money. "Thank you," he said. "And yes, I'll be here tomorrow at 10. "Good lad," replied Bob, and his hand came up and ruffled his hair. "I think me and you will be able to work together quite successfully. Even your tea's not bad." Zed left the garage in high spirits. His life was beginning to come together. He suddenly realised that once he had left school, he could pursue a career as a mechanic and still look after his mum. He had wanted to join the armed forces, but with his mum in such a state, this would at least give him a chance to live. He tucked the money into his pocket and walked in the direction of the park. She woke feeling groggy, and in the moment her brain realised the body was coming back to life. A racking sound erupted from inside her diaphragm and spasmed out of her mouth. This was followed by a series of explosive coughs as her lungs struggled for breath. She sat down with an effort and tried to calm down. Droplets of sweat appeared on her top lip, and she thought of calling for her son for some water, but then thought better of it. He would not come, and anyway was probably out somewhere. Her breathing began to ease, and to celebrate she grabbed a handkerchief from under the cushion, growled at the back of her throat, and spat a small lump of guitar into it. She felt better now. Within a matter of seconds the first cigarette of the morning was lit and in her mouth. Zed's mum looked around her through the haze of cigarette smoke and tutted. The room was a shithole. To an outsider who had just walked in, it gave the impression as though she had been burgled. Plates and strewn clothes littered the floor, and 2 empty glasses lay on their side next to the almost done bottle of vodka. She felt hungry, but could not remember when she had last eaten. Had her son made breakfast this morning? If so, she had no recollection. He was a good lad, but was very lazy sometimes. She knew he didn't understand her, and how she could not leave the house now. The reason was simple. She felt scared. Not of debt collectors or gangsters or the police, just of life. That continuing struggle to make things right and to simply survive the outside world. Life had hit her hard. She knew that. Thank goodness her son was around to look after her. She had decided some time back that there would never be another man in her life. Sex and all that came with it was overrated anyway. Apart from the actual time it produced her a son, the majority of other times was just sweaty men with big egos and tiny cocks. If they took her out for dinner and wined and dined her, that was nice, but it didn't mean that she would have to suck their filthy dick in return. Vodka and cigarettes were her saviours now. Her son was a close second. She sat up straight and put her arms out wide and listened to her bones click. She detected body odour from underneath her dirty blouse. The tips of her fingers were stained with nicotine, and the nails were speckled with white calcium dots. How many days had she not washed or cleaned her teeth? Did it matter? She never went out, and she couldn't remember the last time she had put on some lipstick or makeup on. It was just her and her boy, and she was happy with that. The outside world had never provided her with much happiness, and so she wanted to lock herself away from it. She had no relatives to poke their inquiring noses in. Well, apart from a sister that she hadn't seen since her boy had been born. Even though there was only 5 miles that separated them, they were worlds apart, and she wanted it to remain that way. Her body decided it needed to urinate. That meant standing up and going upstairs to the tiny bathroom. It all seemed so laborious. Maybe if she took her cigarettes, overflowing ashtray, and the rest of that vodka with her, she could have a bath and a change of clothes, or even a small lie down on the saggy double bed first. She still felt hungry, but the lure of the drink ate into her thoughts and won. Her son would be back soon, no doubt, and he would cook something for her. She could wait for that. She loved her son, but felt no remorse for making him look after her. He was only a boy, but would soon be a man. Once that happened, he would become a sex-crazed, selfish bastard, just like her dead husband and all the other pricks she had met in her life. She struggled to her feet and felt a rush of blood run through her brain, which made her feel disorientated. She was proud of the fact that she never suffered from hangovers, but this pain in her head seemed to be increasing day by day. Her head bowed, and she rubbed at her forehead with slow, deliberate movements. She was going nowhere at the moment until this thud in her brain eased. Her small, thin frame shuddered slightly, and almost instantly a film of chilly sweat seemed to cover her whole body. Now she felt cold. What in God's name was happening? A few minutes passed as she remained standing, wishing for it to stop. Her legs wanted to sit back down again onto the crumpled blankets of the sofa, but she denied this movement. If she did that, she knew that the process of getting up again would be worse, and she was really desperate for a pee. The last and worst thing to happen would be for her bladder to let go and just piss herself right there and then. The option seemed so attractive, but her pride resisted. She would not be that woman. There was once a woman that came into the laundrette that she had worked at who used to put on a small wash of what appeared to be baby clothes. There had never been a child with her. The odour that had come from this poor woman had saturated the small workplace within moments. It was almost as if stale urine had penetrated the skin. A sickly smell, and one that was hard to remove. If her son came home now and found her lying on a piss-stained sofa, stinking the place out, she would simply die then and there of shame. That was not going to happen to her. It hadn't always been like this. Not so long ago, she had been a proud woman and a loving and caring mother to her baby boy. He had transformed her and made her world. Then life got in the way and started dealing blows and punches. She had met her husband-to-be at a local dance when she was just 15 and vowed then to be the perfect wife. It was all she had ever wanted in life. She had been a quiet, almost timid child and would let her older sibling dominate the household. Her mother and father had been strict Christians and insisted the family attend church every Sunday. They had both passed away within weeks of each other shortly after she had married, one through natural causes and the other through the heartache of losing the other. It was a sad and desperate end to a long and traditional marriage. When she had been in her teenage years, the longing to meet a man that could love her and look after her was very quickly pushed to the front of her to-do list. She hadn't had many friends and was keen to accept the first proposal that came along. Before his untimely death, her husband had been the only man she had ever slept with. After her son was born, the sex seemed to decrease, and she had assumed that was quite natural. If having sex meant trying for a baby, then so be it. She suffered from postnatal depression for the first 6 months after the birth, and her husband vowed that he would never put up with that crap again, so there were no more children. The rot had started. After a few minutes, the giddiness subsided enough for her to take the decision to head upstairs. She looked down at her hands and noticed tiny brown spots on the top of the skin. Didn't that happen to old people? She was in her early 30s, but felt as though most of her life had disappeared. The previous day, her reflection in the small hallway mirror had shown a few strands of grey creeping into her once full jet-black hair. When was the last time she had checked her face and appearance before heading outside into the open world? She was starting to upset herself. That was not helpful. What she needed was a drink, a smoke, a lie down, but most of all, a pee. She started towards the door leading into the hallway and the beginning of the mountainous stairs. Slowly does it, she told herself, and gradually begun to make her way. Now she was starting to sound like her mother. Sayings such as "a stitch in time" and "nothing is gained by rushing" flooded into her confused mind. She threw them out immediately and returned to the task. On her small journey she stopped and collected her cigarettes and ashtray from the small table next to the sofa. The tabletop was covered in ash and ring marks and previously discarded packets of Embassy No. 6. The vodka bottle lay on its side on the floor. Could she bend down to collect it? She persuaded herself regretfully that this was not going to happen. Not with her head thumping like a hammer and the cold sweat pouring out of every pore on her body. So near and yet so far. Putting it out of her mind and armed with the tobacco and ashtray, she concentrated all her efforts to cross to the stairs. 6 or 7 paces was all it needed, but it seemed like climbing Ben Nevis. Not that she had seen or walked that mountain. She had never been out of the country of England, let alone the big wide world. She had never applied for a passport. "No fucking point, love," explained her dead husband one day. "I love this country, and out there it's just full of foreigners, and they don't serve beer in jugs." This sudden thought made her chuckle, and the noise surprised her. It sounded very alien coming from her lips. 2 more steps and she would be at the staircase. With the smokes and ashtray in one hand, she gripped the rail with the other. It took all of her effort to raise her head and look at the top. The pain returned and she quickly lowered her eyes. "Concentrate," she thought to herself. Puffing gently and hearing a slight wheezing from her chest, she began to step up the stairs. The carpet was worn in the middle, almost to a thread in some places, but to her it was like a red carpet. Get through this and she could relax for the rest of the morning and await her son's return. He would get her a drink, she was sure of it. He often went to the shops for her and got the supplies she needed to survive another hellhole of a day living inside her head. She had now slowly covered 3 more steps and was almost halfway up. Do the same again, and the bathroom awaited her busting bladder. The thought of it almost made her pee herself right there and then. What would it be like feeling the hot fluids sliding down her bare legs? She had giggled in amazement on one occasion a few years previous, when she had witnessed an elderly lady wet herself on the local bus. The woman had been mortified and had gone a deep red in the face with the shame, but this had made it all the more funnier. Now here she was. She shuddered again. Concentrate. Another 3 steps and the top landing was in sight. Her head ached and her legs were straining as though she had 2 sacks of coal tied to her back. All of a sudden the emotion of anger flashed through her. Where the hell was her son? Didn't he realise he needed to be here? Fucking selfish boy. She would tell him so when he got back. 2 more steps and her life would be back on track. She may have to remain upstairs for the duration of the day now if the headache didn't cease. Just as she raised her left foot to place it on the penultimate step, a sudden noise from behind her shattered her concentration. It was just unlucky that the postman had taken this precise moment to physically shove a letter through the letterbox on the front door with a forceful clang which set off a series of events. The first was for her to jump almost out of her skin. The second was that this reaction caused her right hand to release the full ashtray onto the stair carpet and scatter ash and cigarette butts all over. The third was that, unfortunately, the metal pewter ashtray itself fell precisely on the largest 2 toes of her right foot, making her cry out and curse. The fourth meant that the pain from the toe and the verbal exclamation had made her head look back in a subconscious move to find out the cause of the noise. The fifth was the loss of balance. In a matter of seconds, she had fallen backwards down the stairs. The body, just a delicate structure of skin and bone thanks to the years of alcohol and nicotine abuse, had bounced and snapped its way down in 3 devastating turns. Clunk, snap, clunk. On reaching the bottom step, her fragile, already painful head had careered at speed against the floor into the corner of the downstairs hallway and instantly broke her neck and fractured the skull. Now, with broken ribs and a punctured lung from the fall, the already full bladder had released itself to form a pool of urine beside her broken body. The postman, completely oblivious to the chain of events he had just caused, had already walked away and continued with his round, whistling cheerfully to himself. To him, it was just another day of posting bills and postcards through the many letterboxes on his round. To Ruth Dargett, it was a brutal end to a tragic, wasteful life. Her body would not be found until the following day. Then the ambulance man, after forcing open the front door and banging it with force accidentally against the lifeless head, would confirm the policeman's suspicions, and she would be pronounced dead at the scene.